Hey everybody, this is Russ from Retro Game Core. Today we're going to take another look at the AYN Loki Zero. This is a handheld I reviewed a few weeks back, and I was a little bit torn in that review. Number one, this price is really good. It's $250 for the starting price, but you get some really great features. A really nice handheld in terms of ergonomics, excellent controls, a good screen, and a big battery. And it's quite a bit smaller than the Steam Deck, so if you're looking for a smaller handheld PC, this actually ticks a lot of those boxes. However, there is one place where this actually fails just a little bit, and that is the actual performance. Now, when it comes down to it, for indie gaming, this still works out really well, so any of those lightweight PC titles will work just fine. However, I did find that emulation on the Windows side left a lot to be desired. Well, in this video, we're going to be flipping that concept on its head by testing out emulation on Linux custom firmware. This one we'll be using here today is called JELOS, and it'll allow you to be able to emulate all the way up through Wii U and some pretty hefty Nintendo Switch emulation too. Now, it's not going to be perfect. There are still some limitations with a dual-core CPU like this one, but I think you will be pleasantly surprised at what kind of performance we can get here. So when it comes down to it, when I first got this handheld, I was pretty excited about the concept, the ability to play lightweight PC games, but I was disappointed in emulation. With Linux-based firmwares, we actually can bring that to a head. So now all of a sudden, we have an excellent lightweight handheld gaming PC that can also do a bunch of emulation from an SD card. And so I'm pretty excited in this video here. I'm going to show you how to set all of that up and what kind of performance you can expect. And so without any further delay, let's go ahead and jump right in. Okay, as we get started here, I do have a couple caveats just to make sure that this is going to be the right fit for you. I don't want to overpromise what you can get out of the Loki Zero. Number one, the custom firmware that we're using is called JELOS, which stands for Just Enough Linux Operating System. And if you've been involved in the retro handheld scene for a while, you're probably familiar with it. It's available for a bunch of different Linux-based handhelds. However, the x86 or the handheld PC build that we're going to be using today is still kind of getting its legs. By that, I mean that there are still some things that need to be worked out as they start testing it. There are a bunch of different devices that are supported, including the Loki Zero, but all the same, it is not a super intuitive and drag and drop process like it is with the other Linux-based handhelds. So I do think it's going to require a little bit of know-how to get this set up. As an example, I would say that if you've already set up retro emulation on handhelds before, it should be a piece of cake. However, if this is your very first time setting one up, or you're not very computer savvy, you might run into some issues. Now, thankfully, there is a JELOS wiki page that should be able to walk you through each of those processes. However, like I mentioned before, some of this is still a work in progress. So for example, if you go into individual systems, you may not actually find what you're looking for. So in the meantime, I've made a written guide on my website, and I'll have it linked down below, and this will walk you through some of the hiccups that I had when I first set it up, just so I can prevent that from happening for you as well. Now, I'm hoping that as the JELOS wiki page gets a little bit more fully fleshed, I can just get rid of that written guide and you can just go and refer to their own guide. Anyway, I did want to mention that this setup is not for the faint of heart, in the fact that I would say this is a more moderate or even advanced topic in getting it set up on the Loki Zero. So if you're looking for something that's very plug and play, this may not be the device for you, but that's kind of the fun of the Loki Zero itself, is tweaking it and getting the best performance you can, both on Windows and in emulation. And in this video, we're going to cover all that emulation stuff, but if you're looking for some Windows tweaks in order to make this have the best performance possible, I would recommend this channel here from my friend Kay. He's actually made 2 videos on the Loki Zero already. One was an in-depth review where he walked through some of those Windows preferences that he likes to tweak, and some of those tips will give you much better performance. In addition, he just released another video where he made what he's calling the Loki Zero Ultra. And in this video, he updates the RAM, but then also helps with some syncing issues to make sure that you're getting the best transfer speeds. In addition, he increased the internal storage. So if you want to have more storage capability, he'll show you how to do that in the video. And then also he swapped out the analog sticks. This is mostly a cosmetic upgrade, but I still think it looks really nice. Either way, if you want to optimize Loki Zero for the best Windows handheld PC gaming experience, I would recommend checking out those 2 videos, but this one here is going to be focusing on emulation. Okay, let's get started with installing JELOS on the Loki Zero. And all the links that you will need to click on will be in my written guide down below. Anyway, the first place we want to go is the JELOS GitHub page. Here on the right side, you'll find a link to the releases section. And once you're there, just go ahead and scroll down till you find the table that says installation package downloads. From there, find the section that's dedicated to x86 devices. Then just click on the link to download the IMG file. Now you can actually install JELOS on basically any storage medium, an SD card, a flash drive, or even the internal storage. In this video, we're going to flash it to an SD card so we can dual boot between this and Windows. And in order to do that, we need to flash this image file to an SD card. The software we're going to use today is called Balena Etcher, but there are many other options out there. So if you don't have this or something else like Rufus already installed, then go ahead and download and install this onto your machine. Now, once we have that file downloaded, let's go ahead and open up Balena Etcher, and we'll select the leftmost option, Flash from File. Now navigate to that JELOS image file that we just grabbed, and then make sure your SD card is plugged into your machine. Next, under Select Target, we're going to select that SD card. You can see that mine is 256 gigabytes in size. Next, all we have to do is just flash it. So we're going to click on that flash button. And because my card is so large, it's giving me a warning about, hey, are you sure you want to do this? And of course, here you can click on the button that says, yeah, man, I want to do it. You're going to get another prompt here, making sure that you really want to do this. And of course, you know what to do. After that, it'll go through the flashing process. This will take between like 3 and 5 minutes. But once that's completed, you can go ahead and eject your SD card from your PC and then put it in your Loki Zero. Now, in order to boot into JELOS instead of Windows, we need to use a USB keyboard. For this example, I'm going to use this one. This can function as both a mouse and a keyboard, but it also comes with a handy USB wireless dongle. That means if I pair it with a USB adapter like this one, I can plug it directly into the Loki Zero, and this will function as both a keyboard and a mouse. And again, I'll have all this stuff linked down below in case you don't have one of these accessories. Next, we're going to power on the device, and as soon as it powers up, we're going to start tapping on the delete key on that keyboard. This is going to allow us to enter into the BIOS. Now, once we're within here, we're going to navigate over into that boot tab on the right. And there's a section within here called Boot Option Priorities. What we want to do here is change Boot Option 1 from the Windows Boot Manager over into that SD card reader. Next, we just want to save these changes. So we're going to go to the rightmost tab and then select Save Changes and Exit. Now, every time we boot our machine with the SD card inside, it's going to boot JELOS instead of Windows. However, bear in mind, if you take out the SD card and boot into Windows, you'll have to go through this process again in order to have it boot into JELOS first. It's kind of a pain to boot back and forth between those two, but unfortunately Windows will make that override every time you boot into it. Anyway, now that we've made those changes, it will boot into JELOS, and the first time it starts up, it's going to initialize the system. It might take a few minutes, but after a bit, you'll get into the JELOS interface. Now all we have to do is just add our games. Now in all the other versions of JELOS, you can take an SD card and put it into a computer and then just transfer the files directly onto the card. But unfortunately, the x86 version of JELOS does not have that as an option. Instead, the SD card will only be readable by a Linux PC. So we've got basically 4 different options in order to transfer our games onto the card. The first option is just to use a Linux PC if you have one available. So for example, if you have a Steam Deck, you can put it right into the device and then start transferring your files right then and there. However, I do realize that the population that has a Linux PC is pretty small. So let's go over the other options that you can use. The next would be to transfer the files directly onto the Loki Zero. You can do this by using a tool that they have set up within JELOS. So in this scenario, you would use a USB drive and plug it into your JELOS machine, and then under the Tools section, you would go to the File Manager option. This is going to bring up a very simple file management service, and you can navigate through here to browse your external drive and then copy those files and then paste them onto the SD card. This process will be a little bit unintuitive just to kind of get through it, but the transfer speeds on this will be relatively fast. Now, the fourth option is to use a Linux file system software. They have a couple different options available on Windows and Mac, but I've always found those to be unreliable. So instead, we're going to go into the option number 3. And in this option, we're going to use our home network to transfer our files from our home PC over onto the Loki Zero. So let me go ahead and walk you through that process. First thing, you want to press the Start button and then go into the network settings within JELOS. If you scroll down a bit, you will see an option to enable network. Go ahead and turn that on. After that, go into the Wi-Fi SSID and then find your home network and then put in your credentials. Either way, once you've entered that information, you should see a network indicator on the top right once you're connected. Now we want to set up the ability to transfer files wirelessly. We're going to press Start again and then go into System Settings. Within the authentication section, you'll see an option to rotate your root password. What this means is every time you turn on the device, it's going to give a new password in order to connect. We're going to simplify the process just for this one scenario. So I'm going to turn off this option and then I'm going to change my root password to something that's more memorable. And again, I'm doing this within the secure environment of my home network. And so just to make things very easy, we're going to change the password to 1234. And that's it. We've now changed our root password. Also, while you're in here, there's a bunch of different options you can do, like changing the brightness, Or you can also adjust the RGB coloring around the analog sticks and the sides of the device. You got quite a few options here, but right now I'm just going to turn them off so they don't distract us. And finally, we only have one other setting to change. We're going to go back down into the network settings, and then about halfway down in the network services section, you'll see options to enable SSH and Samba. We're only going to use Samba in this example, but let's just go ahead and turn them both on. And finally, while still in the network settings section, go to the very top of the screen. Here you will find your local IP address. It should start with a 192.168.86. Go ahead and make note of that IP address because we're going to need that here in a second. Now back on your PC, we're going to open up a File Explorer window. And then in the top menu bar, we're going to type in a // and then that IP address that we just made note of. So in my example, it's 192.168.86.68. Next, go ahead and press enter and it'll show you your file system here within the JELOS device. However, when you try to open one of them up, it's going to ask for your network credentials. This is where we're going to add our password. So the username is going to be the word root, and then the password is going to be whatever you made it. In our example here, I made it 1234. So go ahead and enter those credentials, and now when you hit OK, you should have connection to everything you need. For the most part, you're just going to stay within the ROMs folder. This is where you're going to drag and drop your game files. So on the left side, I have my wireless connection to the Loki Zero, and then on the right side, I have my external hard drive that is just filled with all of my personal ROMs. And so now setting everything up is going to be as simple as a drag and drop process. However, bear in mind that wireless transfer speeds are not going to be very fast. And given the fact that we're mostly going to be using high-end emulation on this device, that means that many of these file sizes are going to be relatively large. And so as a result, this process will probably take quite some time. To give you an example, it took me one entire evening to move all these files over wirelessly from my external hard drive over to the Loki Zero. So I would say just make sure you allocate enough time to be able to make these wireless transfers. Now, if you have any questions about what any of these folders mean and which file types you can add, on the JELOS GitHub page, they have this really handy table. This is going to show you the name of the system as well as the name of the folder, and then also which file extensions that JELOS will actually use. Now, the plan is that they will eventually transfer all this information over into the JELOS wiki, but like I mentioned before, this is a bit of a work in progress. For example, if we go into the systems column here on the left, and we pick just any random system, you can see that many of these pages are still blank. So again, this is something that will likely improve over time, but as I mentioned, I put all the issues that I ran into in my own setup in my written guide. So my hope here is that if you do run into any problems, you can check out my written guide in the meantime. But of course, I'm hoping that the JELOS wiki will be your single source of information sometime in the future. In fact, the information for a few of these systems have already been populated, for example here with PlayStation 3. Anyway, I'm not going to bore you with the details of setting this up because it's just like any other retro handheld in that regard. So here's a look at my entire setup after I've gone through and done everything. This includes moving my files over, but then also scraping all that box art so I have this nice pretty image. And this right here is just using the default theme within JELOS. I think it looks really good. Anyway, that's essentially how this all works. You can basically navigate through your system, then find your game, and then load it from here. But there are a couple nuanced settings that I want to go over really quickly before we get into testing. Number one, the first option is going to be your game settings. And within here, you can change your settings globally. Now, by default, they've kind of optimized everything already, so I wouldn't really recommend messing with this unless you really know what you're doing. However, within this section, there is an option for per system advanced configuration. This one's really handy. What you can do within here is go into individual systems and then change those settings for that system in particular. So this will be really handy if you want to set, like, for example, a max TDP for each system. And some of these may take some experimentation to find out what works best. Now, in addition to that, you can also make per game configurations. To do that, you want to hover over the game within the menu and then press the Y button on the controller. From there, you can navigate down to the advanced game options, and it's going to be the same as the per system configuration, but specific to that one game. So this is really handy if you want to adjust your power profile for each individual game. Again, this is a bit of a more advanced topic, but once you get the hang of it, it is pretty simple. So now what I want to do is just kind of go over the emulation options that you will find within JELOS on the Loki Zero. We're going to start with the very lightweight stuff and then work our way up and see what kind of bottlenecks we run into. As you can expect, when it comes to the low-end systems, all the way up through like the 16 and 32-bit era, absolutely no problem here. And the nice thing here is these games do not require a lot of power. So if you go in and tweak those power profile settings correctly for each system, I would expect to get between 4 and 6 hours of gameplay with these lightweight systems. Now, not every single thing is going to play perfectly. For example, when it comes to arcade emulation, most of these games will work fine. But when it comes to those heavyweight arcade games like Killer Instinct, unfortunately, this one does not play at full speed. And this really isn't the fault of JELOS or anything, it's just that we have a dual-core CPU, which will run into these bottlenecks here and there. Now let's start moving into those harder to play systems. We're going to start with Nintendo 64. This one can actually be upscaled to a full 1080p. To give you a comparison, within Windows, Nintendo 64 capped out at around 720p. So we're getting much better performance already with Nintendo 64. Moving up from there, Sega Dreamcast also played better. Here we can also upscale to a 1080p resolution. And much like with Nintendo 64, the cap was around 720p in Windows. Now that being said, I did find a couple games that didn't play at full speed for one reason or the other. For example, NBA 2K2, even when I dropped it down to a native resolution, still struggled to play at full speed. And unfortunately, there were a couple systems which I would not consider to be fully playable. One of those happens to be Sega Saturn. Again, I think we are being limited by that dual-core CPU, but these games, no matter what I tried, didn't play at full speed. This is weird because another custom Linux firmware called Batocera actually can play these at full speed, so I'm not really sure what's going on here with JELOS. One thing I did notice is that the standalone Yabasan Shiro emulator is not available within the x86 version of JELOS. And that might be the culprit, I'm not really sure what's going on. Either way, at least in this testing right here and today, Sega Saturn wasn't fully playable. Now that being said, there are a lot of other systems that are, so let's keep moving on. Next up is Sony PSP. Every single game that I threw at it ran at a 4x resolution, which is 1080p. And given that's the max resolution of the screen, that's the best we can hope for anyway. And it doesn't matter what game I threw at it, including God of War Chains of Olympus, one of the hardest games to emulate, still played great. So this is going to work out just fine when it comes to high-end PSP emulation. Another handheld system that worked really well was Nintendo 3DS. And I was surprised because by default, JELOS uses the RetroArch version of Citra, not the standalone one. But even when upscaling to a 2x resolution, every game I tried actually played fine. There were some stutters at the beginning of the level as the shaders started to compile, but that is very typical of Nintendo 3DS emulation. Either way, no matter what Nintendo 3DS game I've tried, after those first couple stutters, everything was really smooth. So I think you will be able to play Nintendo 3DS relatively easily on this machine. Now, the other devices we're going to test for the rest of the video are a little bit more complicated. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that the emulation experience is not fully formed within JELOS right now. For many of these emulators, you'll have to plug in an external keyboard and then press escape and then navigate through this individually. Unfortunately, there is no way to just boot into these emulators within JELOS. And while they have optimized some of those configurations, some other ones will need to be tweaked here and there. And this is why I mentioned in the beginning that this setup, at least right now, is not for the faint of heart. Another thing to note is that as we start pushing this system, the fan speed is going to kick in quite a bit. And the fan noise will get rather loud. It's very similar to what you can find on a Steam Deck when it's pushed to max performance. Let me go ahead and give you a quick listen right here so you know what to expect. Now, with all those caveats out of the way, let's go ahead and just talk about the raw performance that we can get on the Loki Zero. We're going to start here with PlayStation 2. By default, I set this to a 2x resolution, which will be around 900p depending on the game. Either way, that is a pretty high upscale for this 1080p display. And as you can see here, basically every PS2 game that I tried actually ran really well. There were a couple that would have some slowdowns here and there, but I found them to be perfectly acceptable. The only game I had to make a dramatic change to was God of War 2. For this one, instead of playing it at 2x resolution, I had to play it at the native resolution. However, I did find that it still looked pretty good on the Loki Zero, especially when I used a widescreen cheat. So in the end, I do think that the Loki Zero is capable of playing PS2 emulation basically every game you can think of. However, you may have to adjust some games to a native resolution here and there. I also wouldn't call it perfect emulation. I think you will still get a couple stutters every once in a while, but I don't think it's a deal breaker. So in my own assessment, I am going to say that JELOS now makes the Loki Zero a PS2 capable device. And it's a very similar story with Nintendo GameCube. For this one, every game that I tried actually would run at a 2x resolution, but I would have to swap between the Vulkan and OpenGL backend depending on the game itself. By default, I prefer to use Vulkan because that tends to be faster, but it may cause some occasional graphics issues, and so as a result, you may have to use OpenGL instead. Regardless of the graphic backend, no matter what game I tried, everything played at a 2x resolution with occasional slowdowns here and there. For example, F-Zero would have a stutter every once in a while in like the first lap, but then after that it would be pretty good. Nintendo Wii was a very similar story. Most games actually would play at a 2x resolution. However, there were a couple strange things. For example, with New Super Mario Bros. Wii, I would get a hiccup every once in a while. I don't think it was a shader compiling, it almost felt like a frame timing issue instead. Now that being said, there were some heavyweight Wii games that did have to be dropped down to a native resolution, and even then I did get some slowdown here and there, for example with Donkey Kong Country Returns. So not perfect Nintendo Wii emulation, but very, very close. Now this is probably surprising, but the next generation of a Nintendo console, the Wii U, actually played better than the regular Wii. For this one I kept everything at a native resolution, but almost every single game that I tried played perfectly. That'll include more lightweight 2D games like New Super Mario Bros. U, and it'll be a similar story with some of the indie titles that released on the Wii U. This will be great if you have specific games you want to play on this system without having to boot into Windows. Additionally, I was surprised to find that 3D-based Wii U games like Mario Kart 8 and even Super Mario 3D World work just fine. In fact, every single Wii U game that I tried played perfectly fine at a native resolution, although I would get a couple stutters as the shaders were compiling. However, it is one of those things that the more you play these games, the better they will be. The only game where I noticed performance issues was Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild, and this is easily the hardest game to play on the Nintendo Wii U, and here I'm playing it at a 720p resolution with a 30 frames per second cap. However, even after playing this game for about 10 minutes and letting as many shaders compile as I could, I was still getting an average of about 25 frames per second. So I would consider this to be a somewhat compromised emulation experience. It's not going to be silky smooth. However, if you're really desperate to play this game on the Loki Zero, I would say that it still might be worth your time. Okay, next up we're going to try Nintendo Switch. We're going to start with lightweight games. For some of these, you can actually play them in docked mode. This means you're going to get a full 1080p resolution depending on the game, and yeah, they're going to run great. However, as you start moving up, you will probably have to turn everything into handheld mode and then just keep it at that. But all things considered, I was actually very surprised at how many Nintendo Switch games actually played at full speed. Now bear in mind that I did max out the TDP here just to make sure we had the best performance possible, and that is going to make the fan noise quite loud, so it's not going to be a very quiet experience. In addition, pushing these to a full TDP is also going to decrease your battery life. I would expect on average about an hour and a half when you're really pushing it, so not the best battery life in the world, but if you want to do Nintendo Switch emulation on a device that costs under $300, this is your only option right now. And I was really surprised to find that some 3D-based games like Crash Insane Trilogy and Super Mario 3D World actually played at full speed. Not only that, but the companion game for Super Mario 3D World, which is Bowser's Fury, actually played at full speed too. Now bear in mind we're using handheld mode, which means that Bowser's Fury is going to run at 30 frames per second. But all the same, this is a game I did not expect to be playable on the CPU, but here we are. Now, of course, there are going to be some games that are not going to be as playable. For example, Hades does not run very smoothly at all. Thankfully, this game runs just fine on Windows, so you can just play it on that side instead. And of course, the more heavyweight games like Super Mario Odyssey just doesn't stand a chance. This one will not play at full speed. Other games have pretty good speed but have graphical issues. I don't know if this is an issue with Yuzu on Linux or with JELOS in particular, maybe it's graphics drivers, but there were quite a few games I found within JELOS to not be playable on the Loki Zero because of the graphics themselves. Regardless, the Nintendo Switch emulation on JELOS exceeded my expectations for the Loki Zero, so I'm happy either way. And finally, there were two other systems I tried that were just basically unplayable. The first is the original Xbox. There were a couple games like Halo Combat Evolved, which was very close to being playable, but there were too many slowdowns for me. And of course, as you start getting to the harder to emulate games, there's not a chance at all. This is averaging about 12 frames per second. Another system I wasn't really able to test on the Loki Zero was PlayStation 3. And this really isn't a performance thing, but a configuration within JELOS. For example, on my device, the controls just didn't work at all. And unfortunately, even plugging in an external keyboard would not actually function correctly. This is also one of those systems where you can't get into the emulation settings, so I can't remap the controls. So unfortunately, PS3 just wasn't something I could test. However, given the fact that we have a dual-core CPU, I don't expect any of these games to be playable anyway. And before we start wrapping up, one other thing to note is that you can use this JELOS SD card with other handheld PCs. For example, the Win 600 has the exact same CPU as the Loki Zero. Unfortunately, this one does not have a microSD card reader, but you could use a USB reader and then boot it from there. And I was surprised to find that the emulation performance within JELOS was exactly the same as the Loki Zero on the Win 600. So that means that systems like Nintendo GameCube, Nintendo Wii U, and even Nintendo Switch had the same performance on this device. And the reason why this was surprising is because the Win 600 unfortunately uses single-channel RAM. However, when it comes to emulation, RAM isn't really that big of a deal, and so as a result, it doesn't really affect the performance with these systems. Now, when it comes to PC gaming, it's a totally different story because those are going to be more GPU reliant, and in those cases, having dual-channel RAM will give the Loki Zero an advantage. And another thing to bear in mind is that even though these games will play on the Win 600, it's not going to be the same experience. And a lot of that has to do with the controls. The Win 600 is a D-pad centric device, which means that any analog stick gameplay just doesn't feel very good. And I've made a bunch of videos about the Win 600 where I've discussed that in detail. But really the nice thing about this is that you can use that same JELOS SD card on other devices and not have to deal with that configuration all over again. For example, here's my AYN Air Pro. This has a processor that's more powerful than on the Loki Zero. And so as a result, using the exact same SD card, I can play games like Super Mario Odyssey even in docked mode at full speed. So that's one of the benefits of making a JELOS SD card, is that you can use it with other devices for years to come. Okay, and so in wrapping up here, I want to show you a Loki Zero emulation report card. And this is a quick comparison against the Windows emulation experience that I showed in my review video, and the emulation performance that we saw in the video today. Now, I did make some asterisks, so for example with Sega Dreamcast, most games will play in 1080p, but there are going to be some exceptions where they will not play at that upscaled resolution. Either way, as you can see across the board, we have a significant improvement for each of these systems other than the ones that are being bottlenecked by the CPU. So unfortunately, some of these just may never be playable because of that dual core setup. But as you can see, if emulation is what you're looking for, then I would highly recommend using a custom Linux firmware like JELOS. Anyway, that's really about it for this video here. I wanted to show you how JELOS is set up in the first place and then what kind of emulation performance you can expect. And I think you'll agree that this is a night and day difference between what we were seeing within Windows. And for me, this is the best of both worlds. If we want to play lightweight PC games, we can do that within Windows no problem. But then also, if we want to emulate all the way up to Nintendo Switch in some cases, we can do that within JELOS. And so for me, this is like the ultimate dual boot setup, and I just love the fact that this comes in at under $300 as well. We finally have a budget handheld PC that excels in two different ways. So if you're the kind of person that wants to have a smaller handheld that won't break the bank, and you want to focus on more lightweight PC games within Windows and then also high-end emulation, you can kind of have both of these right here. So let me know what you think in the comments down below. Has this changed what you think about the Loki Zero, or are you going to wait for something better down the line? As always, thank you for watching, and be sure to like and subscribe if you found this helpful, and we will see you next time. Happy gaming!